The wind came down from the hills like it carried a secret. It pushed through the open door of the Broken Spur saloon, carrying the smell of rain and horse sweat, swirling the cigarette smoke into ghostly ribbons. Inside, a small crowd had gathered around the poker table in the corner. The game had been going for hours, and the whiskey had long since turned from comfort to poison. Clayton Reeves sat hunched over his cards, hat low, jaw tight. His hands shook, but not from drink. The lines in his face told stories of droughts, dead cattle, and bad luck. All the same, he'd come to this table chasing one more miracle. He told himself that if he won tonight, he'd pay off the mortgage and keep the ranch for his daughter, June. He told himself that God owed him this one. Across from him sat the McCade brothers, Illy, Jesse, and Boone, the biggest men in 3 counties and the meanest in 2. They owned the kind of power that didn't come from land or money, but from fear. People said they were born with sawdust instead of hearts and blood as cold as well water. Illy, the eldest, handled the cards. Jesse leaned back in his chair, boots on the table, and Boone sat quiet, his pale eyes flicking from hand to hand, reading every twitch. Clayton pushed his last few chips forward. "Call," he said, his voice rough as sandpaper. The room fell into silence. The only sound was the slow creak of the ceiling fan overhead. Illy's eyes glinted as he laid down his cards. A straight flush in spades, clean, brutal, final. Clayton froze, then slowly he spread his hand on the table, a royal flush in hearts. The crowd gasped. For one heartbeat, he almost believed he'd done it. Then Illy smiled, and something in that smile turned the whole room to ice. "Well, I'll be," Illy said, leaning forward. "Reeves, I reckon you forgot the rule we said at the start. No money, no stake." "I've got a stake," Clayton said. He gestured toward the few coins and a silver watch on the table. His voice cracked. "You can have it all. Hell, take my horse too. I'll ride home on foot." Illy shook his head slowly. "Not enough." His brothers exchanged glances. Jesse's grin widened. Boone looked down at the cards, his jaw tightening. Clayton's face paled. You said I could borrow against my land." "And you did," Illy said. He tapped the table once, deliberate. "But when you ran out of land, you made another offer. You remembered, don't you? The saloon went still. The piano player stopped halfway through a song. Even the wind outside seemed to hold its breath." Clayton's throat worked as he swallowed. His eyes darted toward the door. June stood there, 20 years old, proud, wearing her late mother's riding coat. She had come to drag him home, to stop him before he lost everything. But she was too late. She saw the look in her father's eyes and knew. "Pa," she whispered. Illy turned toward her, the lamplight flickering across his scarred face. "Miss Reeves," he said, polite as a preacher, "seems your daddy's luck just ran out. But don't you worry, we'll keep you safe till he pays his debt." Clayton shot to his feet. "You can't, that wasn't, I didn't mean, you gave your word." Jesse interrupted, his voice like gravel. "A man's word is law in this town, ain't it?" No one spoke. The dealer coughed once and looked away. June's eyes burned, but her voice stayed calm. "How much?" she asked. Illy studied her, then said softly, "More than he'll ever make." Outside, thunder rolled over the plains. Clayton sank back into his chair, staring down at his empty hands. June stood there a moment longer, her shoulders straight, her face unreadable. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said, "I'll go." The McCades gathered their winnings, stood, and walked to the door. Boone paused as he passed June. For a heartbeat, his gaze softened, something human flickering through the cold. Then he turned away and followed his brothers out into the storm. June looked back at her father one last time. He was still staring at the table, broken and small. When the door swung shut behind her, the saloon fell silent again. The wind howled, the lamps guttered, and somewhere outside, a horse whinnied into the dark. That was the night the plains swallowed June Reeves whole, and the night her father's soul began to die. The morning after the storm broke hard and cold. Gray clouds hung low over the plains, and the earth was soft under the horses' hooves as the McCade brothers rode out with June behind them. They hadn't bothered with chains or cages. A single rope tied to her saddle horn was enough. June didn't try to run, not yet. She rode straight, backed, eyes fixed on the horizon, the wind tearing through her hair. No one spoke for miles. The silence was thick, the kind that made a person start to hear their own heartbeat. Boone, the youngest, rode closest to her. Every so often she caught him glancing her way, but he never said a word. Illy led the way, his hat low, his posture relaxed, a man completely in control of every mile and every soul around him. Jesse rode last, humming a tune too quiet to make out, but just loud enough to get under the skin. The McCade Ranch came into view near dusk, a stretch of land fenced with dark cedar and guarded by 2 riders at the gate. The main house sat on a rise, long and low, with light spilling from the windows. Barns, corrals, and a blacksmith shed spread out behind it like the bones of a creature half buried in dust. It was big enough to be a kingdom, and the McCades ruled it like kings. When they stopped, Illy turned to her. "You'll stay in the bunkhouse for now. Work starts at dawn. You pull your weight, you eat, you try to leave." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The sound of Jesse's horse shifting behind her said enough. June nodded once. "Understood," she said, voice steady. That first night, sleep didn't come easy. The bunkhouse was cold, filled with the smell of old hay and leather. The other hands kept their distance, whispering when they thought she wasn't listening. Some pitied her, others sneered, a few just avoided her altogether. She stared up at the rafters until morning light crept through the cracks in the walls. By the 3rd day, her hands were blistered raw from scrubbing tack and hauling water. She didn't complain. When Jesse barked orders, she followed them without a word. When Illy watched her from the porch, she met his gaze and held it. Boone would sometimes drift near while she worked, offering a canteen, a wordless nod, a small kindness he tried to hide from his brothers. The land itself became her teacher. She learned which horses bit, which kicked, which would bolt at the scent of coyotes. She found the quiet spots by the creek where the cottonwoods grew thick, and the wind carried the smell of rain. When no one was watching, she practiced cutting the rope that tethered her saddle, testing how fast she could do it with the dull knife she'd hidden in her boot. Not for escape, not yet, just for the knowing. Days stretched into weeks. The McCades began to argue more often. Illy wanted her close, under watch. Jesse wanted to be rid of her, said she was bad luck. Said the ranch hands worked slower with her around. Boone stayed quiet through most of it, except one evening when he spoke up over dinner. "She's done everything we asked," he said. "She's not trouble." Jesse slammed his cup down. "Not yet." June sat at the far end of the table, her plate untouched, eyes lowered. She could feel the heat of their words, the tension thick enough to choke on. Later that night, she heard Illy's voice outside her door. "He'll come for her eventually," he said low. "When he does, we'll take the land too, every acre." "He won't come," Boone said. "You know he won't." There was silence, and then the sound of boots walking away. June pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and stared out at the moonlit yard. Her father wouldn't come. The truth sat heavy in her chest, but behind the sorrow something else was forming, something sharp, something alive. The next morning she rose before dawn. When Illy came out to give orders, she was already in the corral, calming a spooked mare that none of the men could handle. The horse reared, its hooves flashing in the early light, but June didn't back down. She moved slow, spoke soft, and the animal stilled, trembling but quiet. Illy watched from the fence, his expression unreadable. "You've got away with them," he said at last. June didn't look up. "They just need someone who isn't afraid." He smiled faintly. "You'll last longer than I thought." She wiped the dust from her hands, turned, and said, "I plan to." As the sun climbed higher, she caught Boone watching her again from the barn doorway. She held his gaze for a moment before turning away. He didn't follow. By the end of that week, the first hints of winter had crept into the air. The wind turned sharp, and the cattle bellowed against the coming cold. June stood by the fence one evening, looking toward the distant line of hills where her father's ranch used to be. The sky was turning red, and a coyote called out somewhere far off. She didn't know what came next, but she knew one thing. She was done being someone else's debt. The McCades thought they owned her. Soon, They'd learn what it meant to hold something they couldn't keep. The first frost came early that year. By mid-November, the air carried the sting of winter, and the sky hung low and colorless over the plains. The grass had gone brittle, the water troughs crusted with ice. June woke before dawn each day, her breath a ghost in the cold, her body hardened by labor and silence. She had been on the McCade ranch for nearly 3 months now, long enough to know every fence line, every weak latch, every path that led out into the hills. Long enough to understand that the men who ruled this place believed she'd given up. They mistook quiet for surrender. They were wrong. Illy had grown cautious around her, watchful, as if he sensed something moving beneath the calm. He spoke less, but his orders carried more weight. Jessie, restless and cruel, pushed harder with every passing day, trying to draw some crack in her composure. Boone kept to himself, avoiding her gaze altogether, though sometimes she'd find small signs that he still had a conscience, an extra blanket left on her cot, a horse quietly saddled when she needed one. But June had stopped looking for kindness. She was studying weakness instead. The McCade empire was built on fear, and fear only worked when everyone believed in it. She started small, talking to the ranch hands in quiet moments, the young ones first, the ones who'd been cheated in their pay or beaten for mistakes. She didn't promise freedom. She just spoke of fairness, of pride, of what it meant to work for a man who'd gamble away another person's life. They listened and they didn't argue. Then came the day the sheriff rode up with a notice. Clayton Reeves, her father, had vanished. The ranch, what was left of it, had been auctioned to pay debts, the land parceled out to strangers. June watched from the porch as Illy read the letter, a small, satisfied smile pulling at his mouth. He tossed the paper into the dirt and ground it under his boot. "He's gone, then," Illy said. "That settles it." June didn't speak. She turned and walked back to the barn, every step echoing with the hollow sound of finality. Her father was gone. The debt was gone. And now there was nothing left to bind her but will. That night, the wind howled through the valley like it was alive. The men drank themselves mean in the bunkhouse. June saddled a mare under cover of darkness and rode out to the high ridge above the McCade lands. From there, she could see the lights of the main house flickering below, yellow and soft through the mist. She sat for a long time, staring down, her breath fogging in the cold. In the distance, the cattle stirred restlessly in their pens, hundreds of them. The McCade's wealth and power walking on 4 legs. She'd spent weeks learning their routes, the gates that stuck, the fences that sagged. All it would take was one spark of chaos, one night of confusion. By dawn, smoke rose over the hills, not from fire, but from dust and hooves. The ranch hands she'd spoken to had driven half the herd out through the broken south gate, scattering them into the canyons. The sound was thunder, the earth itself trembling as freedom took form in motion. Illy burst from the porch, rifle in hand, shouting orders. Jessie was already in the saddle, cursing and spurring his horse into the stampede. Boone stood frozen, his face pale as he watched the valley below turn into chaos. Then he saw her. June sat on her horse at the ridge line, the dawn rising behind her in a blaze of red. Her hair whipped in the wind, her coat snapping around her like a flag. Illy raised his rifle, eyes narrowing. "You'll regret this, Reeves," he shouted. June's voice carried back clear and steady. "You can't own people, Illy, not me, not anyone." He aimed, but she was faster. Her rifle cracked once, the bullet hitting the dirt near his boots, close enough to send dust flying up into his face. Not a kill, just a warning. The McCade men hesitated, and in that moment she turned her horse and rode hard toward the rising sun. Behind her, the herd thundered onward, wild and free, and the shouts of the McCades faded into the wind. She didn't stop until the ranch was a memory behind her, a smear of smoke and dust on the far horizon. By the time the sun stood high, she'd reached the old canyon trails where the McCades' power couldn't follow. Weeks later, word spread through the border towns of a new ranch being built near the foothills. run by a woman who worked beside her hands, paid fair wages, and carried a rifle with a steady aim. Some said she'd been born lucky. Others said she'd been cursed and fought her way free. When travelers asked her name, she only said, "June Reeves," and went back to work. The McCade brothers never came looking for her again. Maybe they knew better. Maybe they feared that, this time, the bet wouldn't end the way they wanted. And when the wind swept down from the hills, it carried a whisper not of debt or shame, but of a woman who had taken her fate back from the hands that tried to own it.